Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, the Whip Union, and in this one, there are numerous advances in favor of the Russians across the front line. In the Sumi region, the Russians have managed to advance into western and eastern parts of it. Russians also managed to advance near the Kharkiv-Belgorod border in the northeastern region of Kharkiv. Russians continued advances across the Serbets River line in the Toretsk direction, where they are collapsing the Ukrainian positions within the operationally encircled area on the western parts of Toretsk. Russians advance further westwards on the eastern flank of Pokrovsk as they continue storming the defensive line of the Ukrainians to the east of the city for the operational encirclement of it. Russians also continued advances in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. Beyond these frontline developments, Donald Trump made a statement today where he talked about the war in Ukraine. The first part, in a conversation with Macron, said that during a phone conversation with Putin 2 weeks ago, Putin stated that he was going to launch an offensive to capture the entirety of the four regions in southern Ukraine within 60 days. Therefore, he gave Putin a deadline of 50 days, to which, if he does not stop the war and make a deal with Ukraine, Trump will impose 100% tariffs, secondary tariffs on Russia. This means anyone who makes a deal with Russian products or buys something from Russia and uses that to make their own product and then sells it, then there'll be 100% tariffs on those products that go to the United States. This would have a significant impact on the Russian economy with regards to its trade with the United States. However, this is no deal breaker either, as Medvedev stated on Twitter. Trump issued a theatrical ultimatum to the Kremlin. The world shuddered, expecting the consequences. Belligerent Europe was disappointed. Russia didn't care. While this is naturally an understatement with regards to the impact it will have on the Russian economy, it still shows that Russia will not stop its war in Ukraine despite these consequences. And instead, what we'll be seeing is that the Russians will continue their offensive operations within Ukraine until the war ends. However, Trump is now going to be sending weapons to Ukraine, although he states that Europe will pay for it. He is planning on sending 3 Patriot systems, 2 financed by Germany and 1 by Norway. These systems each have 6 to 8 launchers, and most likely they're going to be PAC-3 MSE, which is the most advanced type, which will be able to recover Ukrainian air defense, especially around Kiev and the Dnipropetrovsk areas, where the most strikes have taken place against Ukrainian air defense systems, which has significantly weakened these air defense systems over the past few months. Now that the Ukrainians are in a significant lack of these systems, new orders are extremely important for them to be able to continue withstanding the Russian Air Force. This means this comes in at a very difficult time for Ukraine and can restore their air defense capabilities to a certain extent. But this also means that the Russians currently have a window of opportunity where the Ukrainian air defense is weaker before these new systems arrive. With regards to the frontline developments, the Russians continued offensive operations, starting out in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. The Russians made 2 small advances, one along the highway and one to the south of it, as the Russians are getting closer to the defensive lines remaining of the Ukrainians in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. The Russians are looking to gain control over Andrivka Klevtsova before pushing onwards towards Zeleny. Despite the foothold within the town, Russian presence is not strengthening there yet. The Russians are focusing on the defensive line to the south to cut off the supplies to Zeleny, isolating the town before storming it to force the Ukrainians to spread out their forces and to divert their supplies, weakening their positions before storming them. While the second advance here west of Mirne is consolidating the positions around the towns of Pidubne and Mirne before advancing towards the next defensive line here in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. To the east of Pokrovsk, the Russians continue offensive operations beyond the defensive line, gaining control over additional fortified positions and reaching the outskirts of Chervony Liman. The Russians are here bypassing Novokonomishny in its entirety, working on the fortified positions of the Ukrainians on the northern flank of the town as they continue storming towns such as Fedorivka, Vinkivka, Tetchikov, as well as Toretsk here on the northern flank before combining their forces near Chervony Liman with Rodinsk, cutting off the main highway to the north of Pokrovsk. The objective is the operational encirclement of the city, gaining control over these fortified positions and settlements in this marked out area will allow the Russians to operationally encircle the city. This means the Russians are just a few kilometers from the operational encirclement of Pokrovsk, which will significantly weaken the Ukrainian defensive positions in the area. The Russians also continue offensive operations in the direction of Kostiantynivka, where they are advancing both within Yablonivka to the southwest of the city and storming the operationally encircled grouping of Ukrainian forces to the west of Toretsk from the south and from the east. Combined with recent assaults from the western flank, the Russians are storming it completely from every direction to take advantage of the operationally encircled forces who have been weakened over the past few weeks of this operational encirclement, storming them directly head on to gain full control over the pocket. The Russians also managed to advance here to the west and north of Delivka, depending on which Delivka you point at. The Russians managed to gain control over some fortified positions and continued offensive operations in the direction of Bilaura and Alexandru on the northern flank of Toretsk. In the direction of Yablonivka, the Russians are storming the southern roads through the town to connect their forces within Alexandru Kalinova in the east with their forces in Yablonivka and gaining control over additional supply lines into the town from the southern flank. The Russians are here looking to gain full control over Yablonivka, the southern parts, and also the northern parts with the fortified positions along the 20504 highway. Before advancing towards the western flank of Kostiantynivka, Russians are here as well, getting closer and closer to the operational encirclement of Kostiantynivka. With regards to the offensive operations within the pocket, the Russians re-entered Novospassky for the first time in months. We see that the Russians are here storming from the high ground where they gain control over the fortified positions to enter into the town, gain and foothold to establish themselves before cutting off the remaining positions of the Ukrainians within Chervenivka and the fortified positions here in the eastern parts of the pocket. The Russians at the same time managed to gain control over the fortified positions and forest patch areas here in the western outskirts of the city of Toretsk, gaining full control over those positions as well as the foothold within Novospassky. The combined assault with the pincer maneuver by the Russian forces to physically encircle the Ukrainian positions within Chervenivka, creating smaller pockets within the larger pocket. This also isolates the fortified positions on the high ground here to the west of Novospassky, with offensive operations on an even higher elevation to the north near Katerinivka, as well as their positions in a lower elevation within Novospassky. The Russians are launching an additional pincer maneuver towards the fortified positions there. And we see that the Russians are creating several pockets within the pocket in an attempt to isolate the Ukrainian forces and weaken their positions. With control over the western outskirts of Toretsk, the Russians now almost have 100% full control over the city. The Ukrainians still have a foothold within the southern district of Toretsk along the fortified positions, which the Russians are currently storming through Chervenivka, to which the Russians would have regained 100% full control over Toretsk. The northern flank with the push here west of Delivka, the Russians are slowly advancing along the main road, gaining control over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the area as they continue offensive operations towards Alexandru Shultina and Bilaura. The Russians are slowly advancing along the railways as well as the roads in a northern direction as they gain closer and closer to the city of Kostiantynivka itself. The Russians are unlikely to advance beyond the defensive line here to the southeast of the city before they operationally encircle the city of Kostiantynivka from the northern and southern flanks. In the direction of the Serebets River line, the Russians continued offensive operations on the western bank of it in the direction of Rekhivka, the fortified positions in the area, advancing through the positions within the Luhansk region as they look to threaten the Ukrainian fortified positions in the area and gain full control over the river line itself, gaining full control over the Luhansk region as well. In the northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region, the Russians continue offensive operations on the western flank of Kamyanka. The objective of the Russians is to gain control over the forest patches, strengthening the positions in the direction of Kamyanka, establishing it as a logistical hub, and covering the southern flank of the border area. Russians will likely push along the border and towards the Osk River line, strengthening their positions in between the northern incursion here near Milove and the southern incursion near Kamyanka, gain control over the roads, the towns, and the forest patch areas, fortified positions, everything in between the two positions, widening their bridgehead across the border area and strengthening the offensive operations here in the Kharkiv region for future offensive operations, especially creating the buffer zone along the entire border area. In the northern section here near Sumi, the Russians also continued offensive operations. They managed to improve their positions in the direction of Kindrativka, while continuing their advances within Yunakivka as they continue pressuring and pushing the Ukrainian forces out to the outskirts of the settlement. We see that the Russians continue offensive operations here on the western parts of Yunakivka, where they are pushing towards the Luknia River line in the rear of Yunakivka, gain control over the outskirts of the town, especially in the southwestern parts, would isolate the town from Ukrainian supplies and reinforcements, before gaining control over the remaining parts, establishing a buffer zone around the town and establishing it as a logistical hub for their forces in the Sumi region, strengthening their Russian offensive capabilities and defensive capabilities in the area. Russians, with their continued efforts in Kondrativka, are pushing the Ukrainian forces out of the western parts of the town. Their objective is to cut off the southern road leading into it through the Ukrainian possessions, limiting the Ukrainian supplies going to the town in a similar manner to the Ukrainian cutting off of the road, which would leave just the western flank, which will strengthen their Russian ability to regain control over the town, regaining control over the road leading into the town and the town itself, significantly strengthen the Russian positions and prevents the Ukrainians from achieving success with this counterattack, despite the Ukrainian tactical advantages gained by the initial push, cutting off the road and operationally encircling the town. With Russian reinforcements arriving, they were able to switch the situation around ever so slightly, slowly pushing the Ukrainian forces out of the town. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.